As an apostle preaching the gospel, he had a right to marry, take a wife with him was one of them. Just for kicks, what's another one? To be supported by the church, yeah. He mentioned three things specifically that I had: food and drink, the right to take a wife with him in his travels, and to be supported by the church. Did he use any of those rights, yes or no? No. He mentions twice in verse 12 and again in verse 15, I did not use those rights. What was his pay? Did he consider his reward? Mentioned there in verse 18. Ultimately, yes, but verse 18 says, with regard to his rights mentioned there in chapter 9, his reward is to be able to preach and do so freely. So he could boast then that he preached without, money, or without taking a wife or food and drink, without support from the church, and he considered that something to boast about. And so that was his reward. Anyway, continuing there in verse 19, which is where we left off last week, does that change when I go like that? Does it change the volume? Better? Better for me. All right, verse 19. For though, and I am reading from the New King James Version, I'm kind of like Greg. I got one eye doing this and the other one doing that, so it's difficult to focus and read. If I run off copies of New King James Version, I get larger font, which works for me. Anyway, for though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews, and to those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without the law, I became inferred as without law, not being without the law toward God, but under the law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without the law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you. So not only then did Paul give up the rights, as we just mentioned earlier in verse 9, things that he was entitled to, rightly entitled to, he was willing to forego those in order to preach the gospel, that some might be won. We revisit this idea. Christ had the same issue. Could Christ make believers out of everybody that heard him preach or see him do miracles? No. Did Paul expect to win everybody to Christ? No. He says as much here, that I might win some. So, if he preaches to 1,000 people, we don't know the percentage, but if he reaches a few and they become believers, then for him, that's reward, as it should be for modern Christians as well. So not only did he give up rights as an apostle, things that he was entitled to, but he became something else, and we just talked about that. He became whatever was needed with whatever group he was preaching to win some of that group. For example, I got ahead of myself here. He kept sight of the most important thing, which is to win people to Christ. There's a limit to this. That doesn't mean that he had license to go to a bar and get drunk with the drunks so that he might win some of them to Christ. It doesn't mean that he should go minister to thieves and become a thief so that he might, win some of those thieves to Christ. That's not where we're going here. If you wanted to take it to extremes, he should have taken his scripture with him, gone to the bar, sat at the bar, and started praying and singing hymns and reading from scripture. Could do that, I suppose. Did Jesus eat dinner with sinners? Sure he did. not to become a sinner, not to become like them, but by his example and his preaching while he was there to win them to God. So likewise, Paul had the same sort of thing in mind. So Paul was free to do what he wanted, but bringing people to Jesus was the most important thing to him in using his freedom. From chapter 8, somebody just blurted out here. What was the main theme of chapter 8? It had to do with meat and idols. Christians were free, were they not, to eat meat that was sacrificed to idols? Yes, they were. Yeah, so the idea there, rather than act out of knowledge, which we know idols are nothing, it's better to act out of love. Rather than wound the conscience of the weak Christian and cause him to sin, even though it's not sin to you personally as a Christian, in wounding the conscience of the weaker Christian, you're sinning against Christ, is what it amounts to. So, Paul then could have used his freedom to do that if he wanted to. But what did he say at the end of chapter 8? I'll never eat meat again, if that's what it takes. We kicked some ideas around last week, talking about the lists that people have of the do's and the don'ts. I don't have a healthy view of that concept. Everybody in here has a list of proper and improper behaviors as a Christian. Unfortunately, a lot of those do's and don'ts harken back to the Old Testament. We're not under the old law, folks. We are Christians living under grace. There's a whole host of do's and don'ts. For modern Christians, it shouldn't be about the do's and don'ts. It should be about the who of salvation. You know what I mean? To try to tell somebody to give up some of those do's and don'ts, erase those things from their list, it's a futile thing. They were convinced of it at some time by somebody who was influential in their early childhood. They hold on to it today, even as adult, maturing Christians who should know better. I'm not going to get into all the lists. You know what I'm talking about. Whether it's mowing grass on Sunday, whether it's tithing, keeping the Sabbath, these are Old Testament do's and don'ts. I could get off on that, but I don't want to. Anyway, as Christians, just like Paul, we are free from these things. We are free from the law. Paul at this time is free from the Old Testament law and its obligations, its rules, do's and don'ts. How else was he free? Was he physically imprisoned at this time when he wrote this letter? Nope. Uh-oh. Doubt. He wrote the letter from Ephesus, did he not? I believe that's the understanding I got. But anyway, at this point he wasn't in chains. Freedom from the old law. How else was he free? Not that being married is cumbersome. However, he was free to come and go potentially in dangerous situations without worrying about a wife and a family. So in those ways he was free. He could do pretty much what he wanted to. But did he abuse his freedom? No. Even with all of that freedom as a Christian to do what he wanted religiously, not in prison, free to come and go, he chose to make his life all about ministering for the sake of Christ and winning people to Christ. Some people, it was said, looked at his life as being inconsistent, but not at all. He consistently pursued only one goal, and that was to win people to Jesus. He did things that he didn't have to do. It's like we just read. He became different things to different people depending upon the group that he was ministering to. In Acts 21, for example, over there in verse 23 and 26, or through 26, he participated in Jewish purification ceremonies, which he knew were not necessary for his own life. Over there in Acts 16:3, he had Timothy circumcised. Why did he do that? Because of the Jews. He wanted to relate to them. He wanted them to know in a tangible way. He knew where they were coming from, but let's build from that point on. He had the freedom to tell Timothy, and Timothy had the freedom as a Christian. I don't have to be circumcised. What would that have done for the Jewish audience? It would have offended them. It would have offended their tradition. When Paul, another example, was before the Sanhedrin, did he speak Greek? No. The Bible says he spoke Hebrew. Why did he do that? That was the audience he was talking to. He had to relate to them, identify with them, and they would be more willing to listen to what he had to say. And that's exactly what Scripture says. He spoke Hebrew, and what did the people do? They gave him a listening ear. If he had gone to them and spoken Greek, and started telling how wrong they were in their beliefs and so forth, that wouldn't have gained anything. We know it's true today. Somebody approaches you and says, you're wrong. What do? You put up your shield. There's better ways to deal with that, and we'll get to some of that in a minute. To the Gentiles, he behaved himself as though he were a Gentile, meaning that he let the Levitical laws go, and the Gentiles had never any obligation at all to begin with, so he approached the Gentiles as a Gentile. It says here, he sought to win people to Jesus by being sensitive to their needs and identifying with them. So what this doesn't mean, though, becoming all things to all people, it doesn't mean that we have to compromise the world or with the world in order to fit in. Paul never compromised the scriptural standard in becoming different things to different people. Do that, I suppose. He was willing to forego tradition and familiar. Sure he did. Not to become a sinner, not to become familiar like comforts them, but to reach an audience, Jew or Gentile. Another example over there in Acts 17:22 in Athens. What do we know about the Athenians when Paul first went to them? They were Christians, right? No, they were pagans. They had a god for everything. When Paul came on the scene, he noted, he didn't say that you're wrong in your pagan belief. What did he do? It's right from Scripture. Oh, I see that you are very religious. He met him on some common ground. Even though he disagreed vehemently with paganism, he acknowledged their religion. They were religious. And so he built on that. Lest I forget this one over there in Acts 22, he related to the Roman guards who were getting ready to flog him. He spoke in a way that appealed to them as Roman citizens. He could have been completely quiet, taking the flogging. Why would anybody want to do that, right? He said, I'm a Roman citizen. So he related to them, became a citizen, and thereby he spared himself a flogging. So I guess the question is, after we read this, as far as application, how do modern Christians, we at Cabin Swamp, become all things to all people? First question, are we willing to do that? Are we willing to go places where we don't want to go to become or identify with people in that setting, meet them where they are, to bring them to Christ? Honestly, I have some issues with places where God would tell me to go. I don't want to go there. Do you think Paul wanted to go places where he knew that he might be stoned and left for dead? Probably not. It's part of the list we were talking about last week. If a person claims to be a Christian, and hopefully in my case, I've been around here 40-some years, you hopefully know my reputation. You know, if I went in there and you saw me come out, you shouldn't say, oh, he's in there to get drunk. You should say, he must have a good reason to go in there. Right. What are you going to do? I know. Yeah. And that's the part I struggle with. If I was to become everything to all people and try to keep all the do's and don'ts on every one of our lists, what would I do? I'd sit in the house and pull the shades. Well, I'm not spreading the gospel when I'm doing that. So this is just Joe says, come on, folks. You're New Testament Christians. You're mature. You've been in the Word a long time. Grow up. That's not what Paul says. He says, forego my right to think that way. Don't go there. You know what I'm saying? That's what he's saying. It's a difficult teaching. Because wherever you go, whatever you do, whenever you do it, you're messing up somehow in somebody's eyes. You can't. So my contention, my personal contention, like I mentioned last week, is use that as a platform for teaching. You know, I'll shut off the mower on Sunday. Come on in the house. Let's talk about it. Have a cup of tea, you know, and try to be rational, scriptural to you. But enough of that. There's places I don't want to go and deal with people I don't want to deal with. When's the last time, I'm getting off here, this church of ours here, Cabin Swamp, sponsored a prison ministry? It's places we don't want to go. People we don't want to talk to because we know their history. You worked in the prison system. And undoubtedly you saw people coming and going, ministering, you know. It's not someplace I want to go, really. Yeah. Anyway, some things that we can do to be all things to all people. First of all, we can listen. Everybody wants to tell their story. It's human nature. I'm the same way. You know, I'm not throwing rocks at anybody else. We want to tell our story. We want to tell about our travels, what we did as kids, our achievements in life. We want people to know that, don't we? Do a little exercise. When you're talking with somebody that you're kind of familiar with, but you don't really know their story, when you leave and you think about that conversation, your interaction with them, do they know more about you or do you know more about them? Most of the time, I would say, you walk away, and if you think about it, those people probably know more about you than you know about them. That's our nature. We want to tell our story. But when it comes to being all things to all people, for the sake of the gospel and spreading the gospel, sometimes we need to close that and listen to their story. Otherwise, how do we know where they are with regard specifically, you know, to a Christian life? People tend to be more likely to listen if we give an opportunity. Yeah, people are more likely to talk if we give an opportunity, if we're willing to listen. Second thing, and these things are universal. Be kind. Over there in James chapter 1, 19 and 20, we should be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. The anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Boy, how that true? Yeah, how true that is. You approach somebody mowing their grass on Sunday. You hop out of your car, you run over there. You're messing up. Is that spreading the gospel? Nope. That's putting up a barrier. The better approach might be, I see you got weeds growing everywhere. You know, I'd be glad to come help you on Monday, but, you know, for the weaker Christian, you maybe shouldn't do this on Sunday or whatever. That's an example. That's something I'm guilty of personally. Kindness and respect never go out of style. They're always appropriate, regardless of the subject matter. Third thing, this is something that, you know, we just talked about in Paul's life. Be sensitive to culture. We tend to toss the golden rule out the window in winning people to Christ. And that has to do with what I just said. Go to places we don't want to go. Spread the gospel to people we don't want to really talk to. Golden rule says, do unto others as you would have them do to you. Right? Out of love, we would go to those places we don't want to go and talk to the kind of people we don't. We would invite them to come to church. Here. Who did Christ come to serve? Spiritually sick, not the righteous. Who needs to be in church? Anybody righteous here? Nope. So, we traditionally try to westernize first. This is, I get off on rabbit trails. I was talking to Woody kind of about this idea yesterday. When it comes to, I'm talking about on a global and a missionary setting. Historically, the American way, the American Christian way, is to westernize the culture first and then, teach them the gospel. Why do we do that? It's a hang-up. We need to get past some of that stuff. My example to Woody yesterday is, why do we put clothes on Aboriginal groups that don't see running around with no clothes as a sin? We do when we go to preach to them because we're offended by naked bodies, right? They were born that way for generations and generations. That's how their culture was. It's hot in the middle of the jungle, for example. What do? We go in as Christians, spread the gospel. Before that, we got a condition we have to meet. You got to put clothes on first. You have to throw your culture out the window to become Christians our way. I don't remember anywhere in Scripture Christ putting those kind of conditions on spreading the gospel. Did he? When we go places in our own community to minister to neighbors that we know probably have never attended church, aren't particularly concerned about Christian fellowship, we need to meet them where they are. And that's what Paul's talking about, and that's what he did. We don't make them something else and then become Christians. We meet them where they are. Oh, let's see. And the fourth thing is we need to deal with prejudices. Paul, as a former Pharisee, had to deal with his own prejudice against the Gentiles to properly minister to them. What kind of a Pharisee was Paul? He was a Pharisee among Pharisees, well-educated in Jewish culture. That was his tradition. He had to give that up in order, or I'll say, put this way, put it aside to minister to Gentiles. If he couldn't get past his prejudices, what would have happened? He'd have never gone over to preach to the Gentiles to begin with. Any thoughts on this stuff? Does it make sense what I'm saying? Like Paul, we need to forego our rights. We need to humble ourselves. We need to meet people where they are and do what Jesus calls us to do, which is preach the gospel. Let's see. Did Paul ever offend anybody in preaching the gospel? Whoa, how do we know? Cite one example. I already did. Lystra, what'd they do to him? Boom, they stoned him, left him for dead. Now, Paul's quite a guy, I've said that before. What did he do in that situation, since we're there? He got up and went back into town. Wow. Paul was willing to offend people over the gospel, but he wanted to offend them only over the gospel. He didn't want to offend them by offending their culture, their heritage, their tradition. He didn't say, stop being a Gentile. He said, be a Gentile, but give up the pagan gods. Okay? A difficult concept, because where do you draw the line between culture and behaviors? To become a Christian, though, doesn't mean that you have to give up everything about who you are. You have to change your mindset relating to God versus other things in your past, traditional idol worship or whatever in this situation. So, anyway, continuing verse 24 through 27, Paul talks about the attitude of an athlete. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things, or subjects himself to training. They do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run this way, not with uncertainty, and thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. Got any athletes in here? Baseball players, track stars, boxers? No athletes? Come on, huh? I used to run track in high school. I can identify with what he's talking about here. Any discipline, whether it's athletics or music. Louis Armstrong. This morning I was trying to think of an example. A quote came to mind, but I couldn't remember who said it. It was Louis Armstrong. I miss a practice today, I know it. I miss 2 practices, my critics know it. What happens when you miss 3 practices? The public knows it. Louis Armstrong was a musician, a musical great. Itzhak Perlman, he's another one. He's a violinist, won 15, 16 Grammy Awards, something like that. Played in the company of the president and dignitaries in the White House. Regarded by many as the premier violinist of our day. Plays a, what do they call that? Stradivarius. I don't know which one is the name for it. He practices all the time, 3 hours a day. I kind of like what he says, though. If you practice too much, it's not good for you. If it gets to be drudgery, don't practice anymore. Put it down. So 3 hours a day. But he practices all the time. An athlete. I used to run track. We trained 365 days a year. In the cold weather, up north it gets cold, like -10. Coach said below -10 you can't run because you could frostbite your throat and everything. But we trained all the time. Why did we train that way? Because the coach said so. But he wanted to instill in us, if you go out for track, why are you doing that? To win. Your goal is to win the medal. Not always my case, but Paul's saying, using the analogy of athletics, and we'll get here in a minute, but it's something people understood of the day. The Isthmian Games, that's Isthmean. You say it. Isthmian Games. The games every 2 years are second only to the Olympic Games in popularity. The Isthmian Games were hosted, headquartered in Corinth. If you look on your map, maybe you had it in your introduction. I missed that Sunday. There's a isthmus. That's a land bridge, goes between Greek and the Peloponnese, that's what it was. Peloponnese used to be a peninsula down below, and Corinth is right there on that land bridge. Greece up here, peninsula down here. It's not a peninsula anymore, though, because in late 1800s, somebody dug a canal through that. So technically, it's an island. But anyway, those games were named after the isthmus. And so every 2 years, they had these games, running, competing, and they did it for a prize. Of course, back then, it was a perishable prize, like Paul's talking about, a wreath. So you were esteemed as a winner. Paul is saying he does what he does in the same way that athletes do what they do. They train not to come in second place, they train to win. Paul, we know about his character from reading elsewhere in Scripture. He was all in, whatever he did. He wanted to be the best. He wanted to have a reward, the crown of victory, right? But he's talking here about all the things that he does. He doesn't just train his body casually. This word, bring it into subjection, or the NIV says he beat his body. The word that he used here in Greek means to literally cause bruises on your face. Give yourself a black eye. You train to win. So, the message to modern Christians, Christians here at Cabin Swamp, are we in it to win it? Are we doing what Jesus told us to do, to win Christians to him? We come to Sunday school lessons, we listen to preaching, we involve ourselves in other church activities, hopefully extra church activities, with the Christian goal of winning people to Christ. If we don't do it all in, then we're not doing what Paul says we should be doing by example. Let's see. Paul could have used any number of examples, but like I said, that was something very familiar to those people. They were proud of their games when they hosted it every couple of years. Part of being an athlete, when you're conditioning yourself, or any discipline, whether it's music, whatever it is. My dad used to tell me, if you're going to be a ditch digger, fine, be the best one there is. That's good logic, I guess. An athlete must refuse things that might be fine in themselves but will hinder the pursuit of his goal. Somebody that's going to be in the Olympic Games, say a world-class sprinter, has a special diet that he adheres to, or she, which is in keeping with their discipline. And that's different than somebody that's throwing a shot put. Different body builds, different requirements. Paul says, put away those things that hinder you from whatever your discipline is. In this case, winning people to Christ. Specifically, and this is a throwback to chapter 8, and this is a big deal, eating meat sacrificed to idols. It was a big deal to Paul. Some of the new Christians there would poo-poo it and say, well, it's not that big a deal. Well, it is. If you are causing the weaker brother or sister to wound their conscience, you're sinning against Christ. When is sinning against Christ not a big deal? Yes, it's a big deal. Paul tried to drive that message home to these people because apparently, from what I read, he seems to be finding resistance. He has to tell them. Drive the point home. Folks, this is what you need to be doing. You need to give up these things to become what Jesus wants you to be if it causes your weaker brother or sister to sin. So, Paul reiterates the same idea they talk about in verse 8 and the early verses of verse 9. Give up your rights. Give up freedom. Give up the things that you can do in your Christian liberty for the sake of winning others. He uses this word, disqualify. When we read that, we automatically go, well, if I don't do right, and I don't train and teach like I'm supposed to, I will lose my salvation. I don't think that's where he's going with that. Anybody here? Well, of course we do. We watch football and basketball. We watch golf. Any golfers here? You're a golfer? Okay. All right. There you go. I used to do that too. That's why I carried a whole bag of extra. Drop that thing out there. In pro golf, what happens? They play qualifying rounds, right? If you don't make the cut, you don't move on. It's that way in basketball. Didn't we just finish up the NCAA? I missed all that. But that's what happens. You play games, and if you lose, you're out. You play the winners. Keep on playing until it comes down to two, confronting people, teams, whatever. Same way in golf. If you get to the Masters, you've earned it. You're not a walk-on. You've had to qualify, go through the hoops to get there in competition. Paul then is using this analogy from the athletic world. He would be disqualified if he didn't do those things necessary for training. Not losing salvation, but disqualifying to continue. He felt inadequate in doing what he was doing if he didn't train himself the way he does or did. Going back to the games, if a Greek competitor didn't win his event, was he no longer a Greek? No. He maintained his citizenship. He was just not qualified to move on in the competition. I guess that's what I'm getting at. Who was Paul in competition with? It doesn't come out clearly in Scripture. He was competing against the world, worldly wisdom, Satan. You think Satan wasn't with him? Sure he was, no doubt. The Bible doesn't say that, but we can safely assume so. So he beat himself figuratively, just like an athlete would in training. Enough isn't enough. Not if you want to be the best at whatever you're doing. Paul brought his body into subjection. The language there means to literally lead about as a slave. Paul, while he was a slave to no man, who was he a slave to? Christ. Yeah. He wanted to do what Christ wanted him to do. He wanted to be the best he could be for Christ. And in doing that, Paul subjected his body to training. You think Paul had any cravings? Sure he did. He was human. Don't know what those were. I kind of followed up on that. It's kind of a big question mark what his thorn of the flesh was. Some people suggest it was somebody else who was annoying to him. Some said it was some kind of physical anomaly. Maybe he had a speech impediment. Maybe he couldn't see well. I've read before that, quite often it's believed that he didn't actually write the stuff, that he would dictate it to somebody else who in turn wrote it. Don't know. It's pure speculation. But undoubtedly he had some cravings he had to put behind him. My point was, and I read it somewhere, that possibly he had an addiction that he wanted God to take away. God said, your grace is sufficient. In any case, whatever was going on, Paul wanted to have his mind the master over his body, not the other way around. He didn't give in to his personal desires. He didn't give in to those things that he was free to do. He didn't think that the body itself was evil. After all, it belongs to Jesus. We're reminded that over there in 1 Corinthians 6. We read that. We're a temple. He didn't agree with the ascetics who punished their bodies in a quest for super holiness. There are groups out there, the flagellants, they make whips out of cords and they beat themselves, bloody, either to atone for sin. What's the problem with that theology? Can a better atonement for sin ever have been made than Christ? No. Christ died once and for all sin. So, to behave this way is definitely non-scriptural. Why torture yourself in a misguided attempt to fulfill some atonement? It makes no sense. Or commentary suggests that maybe the same groups of people would go to what we just read about Paul beating his body to attain some sort of higher holiness. Not so. It's not scriptural. Let's see. Paul's use of the word preaching, and this is some stuff that came out, I might share it with you, refers to the office of the herald of the games. Similar to a ring announcer, I guess, in a boxing match. What does a ring announcer do? He's got the microphone, loud voice, kind of a unique way of calling. He identifies the combatants, the contestants, where they come from, what they do. He gives the rules of the engagement, puts the microphone in there so you can hear the referee talk. And at the end of the meet, what does he do? He announces the victor, all that stuff. So it's another way of relating to the Gentiles there in Corinth. They understood what he was talking about when he used this word for preaching. Herald of the games. Proclaims the conditions of the games, displays the prizes, exhorts the combatants, declare the terms, pronounce the names of the victors, and put the crown on their heads. It's kind of what he saw himself. Are you ready? Yeah, go ahead. We'll pick up there then next week, continuing in that section.